Hey guys, tonight we begin with a civilization that didn't just conquer half the known world, it accidentally upgraded it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you had to pick one Roman invention that looks aggressively unimpressive, it would be the arch. It's just stones in a curve. That's it. No spinning parts, no fire, no dramatic lever you can pull while shouting something in Latin. Just curved rocks. And yet, this humble curve may have saved more lives than most emperors ever did. Before arches became widespread, buildings relied on straight beams laid across two supports. It works fine, until you try to make anything bigger than a doorway. Then gravity shows up, crosses its arms and says, no. Straight beams crack. They sag. They collapse at the worst possible moment, usually when people are underneath them. The Romans took an idea floating around the ancient world and perfected it. By using wedge-shaped stones arranged in a curve and locking them together with a keystone at the top, they created a structure that redirects weight outward instead of downward. Translation: the heavier it gets, the tighter it holds. Which is either brilliant engineering or the most Roman personality trait imaginable. This simple curve allowed them to build bridges that didn't immediately panic at the sight of a river. Aqueducts that crossed entire valleys without falling apart mid-flow. Gateways, amphitheatres, multi-story structures, all held together by geometry doing the heavy lifting. Without arches, infrastructure stays small and nervous. With arches, infrastructure gets bold, and bold infrastructure means cities can grow safely. Trade routes expand, water flows reliably. Movement between regions becomes possible without hope it doesn't collapse being the main strategy. The arch turned gravity from a threat into unpaid labour. And here's the beautiful part. It required no advanced machinery, no industrial revolution, just math, stone, and stubborn determination. You stack rocks in a curve, and suddenly you can support enormous weight without everything dramatically imploding. That's not flashy, but it's effective. Many Roman arches are still standing today, 2,000 years later, while modern buildings sometimes retire after 40 years with structural anxiety. The arch doesn't demand applause. It just quietly refuses to fall down. And sometimes, the invention that saves humanity isn't glamorous. It's the one that keeps the ceiling above your head exactly where it belongs, which frankly, we should all appreciate a little more. Now that we've established that curved rocks can hold up civilization, let's move indoors. Specifically, under the floor. The Romans developed something called the hippocaust, an early central heating system that circulated hot air beneath raised floors and inside hollow walls. Yes, heated floors in the ancient world. Meanwhile, most of Europe was still having very intense conversations with fireplaces. Here's how it worked. A furnace, usually located outside or beneath a building, burned wood continuously. The hot air it produced travelled through empty spaces under the floor, supported by small pillars called pilae. From there, the heat moved through clay pipes embedded in the walls. The result? Radiant heat. Not just stand close to the fire and hope. The entire room warmed evenly. And this wasn't limited to one palace somewhere. Hippocaust systems were common in bathhouses and sometimes in wealthy homes across the empire. Now here's why this matters beyond Roman comfort. Cold environments weaken immune systems. Damp, unheated buildings encourage respiratory illness. Large populations living in cold climates without reliable heating face higher mortality rates. The hippocaust reduced that risk. Warmer interiors meant fewer cold-related illnesses. Bathhouses could operate year-round. Public hygiene improved because people were actually willing to bathe when the room wasn't freezing. It also helped control moisture. Drier interiors mean less mold. Less mold means fewer health issues. which is important when your medical plan mostly involves vinegar and optimism. The engineering behind the hippocaust also demonstrates something deeper about Roman thinking. They didn't just build for survival, they built for sustainability. Heating entire public spaces encouraged social interaction. It strengthened community ties. It allowed urban life to function in colder regions of the empire. It made expansion into harsh climates more realistic. And that changes demographic survival rates over time. All because someone asked a very Roman question: what if the floor was warm? The hippocaust wasn't dramatic. It didn't conquer provinces. It quietly improved quality of life at scale. And quality of life improvements increase survival. So while emperors were busy making questionable decisions, Roman engineers were underneath the building, literally, making sure nobody froze to death. Sometimes the innovation that saves humanity doesn't roar. It hums beneath your feet, warmly. Let's talk about something we completely take for granted. Windows, not holes in the wall, actual glass. Before widespread use of glass windows, buildings relied on open shutters, cloth coverings, or thin slices of translucent stone like mica, which is charming until winter arrives and the wind decides to redecorate your living room. The Romans didn't invent glass itself. That credit goes further back. But they industrialized glass production and began using glass panes in windows across bathhouses, villas, and urban buildings. And this is where it quietly becomes life-saving. A glass window allows light in while keeping cold air, rain, and insects out. That means interior spaces stay warmer, drier, more stable, and stable indoor climates reduce illness. In colder provinces of the empire, like Britain or northern Gaul, glass windows helped maintain internal warmth. Combined with hippocaust systems, they created controlled environments in regions that were otherwise damp and miserable for much of the year. Less exposure to drafts means fewer respiratory infections. Less moisture infiltration means less mold growth. More natural light means better visibility without constant fire use, reducing indoor smoke inhalation. Because let's be honest, ancient indoor air quality was already ambitious. Glass windows also allowed urban buildings to be taller and more enclosed without turning into caves. You could build multi-room structures that retained warmth while still being illuminated during the day. That changes architecture. It changes daily life. It reduces dependence on constant open flames. And reducing open flames in dense wooden cities reduces, well, entire neighborhoods disappearing overnight. So yes, glass windows sound mundane, but they create controlled interior climates. And controlled environments are one of the most important factors in long-term human survival. The Romans understood something subtle. You don't just protect people from enemies, you protect them from the elements. Wind is not a personality trait. Cold is not character building. Moisture is not inspirational. Glass turned buildings from shelters into systems. And when your shelter functions properly, everything else becomes more stable. It's not dramatic. It doesn't involve legions. But it does involve fewer people getting sick, because their living room isn't technically outdoors. And that's the kind of quiet innovation that keeps civilizations alive. Sometimes, saving humanity is as simple as putting transparent rock in a wall and calling it progress. Now let's move from buildings to something far more fragile: knowledge. Before the Romans popularized the codex, most written works were stored on scrolls. Scrolls are elegant, dramatic, great for theatrical unrolling. They are also wildly inconvenient. If you wanted to reference something in the middle of a scroll, you had to unroll half of it while praying it didn't tear. Finding a specific passage was less efficient research and more archaeological excavation. Then came the codex. Instead of one long sheet rolled up, the codex consisted of individual pages bound together along one edge. In other words, the early book. Now this might not sound revolutionary, but it absolutely was. The codex allowed information to be accessed quickly. You could flip directly to a section. You could write on both sides of a page. You could organize content more efficiently. This improved legal systems, medical references, military manuals, and religious texts, which means it improved survival, medical knowledge preserved more accurately, legal codes standardized more clearly, military logistics recorded more efficiently. The codex also made copying and distribution easier. Ideas traveled faster, knowledge became portable, and portable knowledge increases resilience. When information spreads effectively, societies adapt faster. They recover faster. They improve systems over generations instead of starting from scratch. The Romans did not invent writing. They did not invent parchment. But by normalizing the codex format, they fundamentally changed how knowledge was stored and transmitted. And here's the quiet impact. The codex format was later adopted widely by early Christian communities, helping preserve religious and philosophical texts that shaped Europe for centuries. In other words, this simple binding technique influenced the survival of entire intellectual traditions, all because someone looked at a scroll and thought, there has to be a less annoying way to do this. The codex doesn't look dramatic, it doesn't conquer territories, but it preserves memory. And memory is civilization's immune system. Without preserved knowledge, each generation starts over. With it, humanity builds upward instead of looping in confusion. So yes, the humble bound page may have saved humanity more effectively than 1,000 marble statues, because ideas that survive help people survive. And that's a very Roman upgrade. We've talked about moving water. Now let's talk about stopping it. Because rivers are helpful, until they aren't. Floods destroy crops, destroy homes, destroy entire towns. And in the ancient world, when your harvest disappears, your survival rate politely follows it off a cliff. The Romans developed advanced dam building techniques across their empire, particularly in Spain and North Africa. They built massive stone gravity dams that held back reservoirs of water for irrigation and urban supply. This wasn't primitive pile-of-rock improvisation. These were engineered structures designed to resist water pressure through sheer mass and clever construction, which meant something radical for the time: predictability. Instead of relying solely on seasonal rainfall, communities could store water. Irrigation systems fed crops consistently. Drought impact was reduced. Flooding could be moderated. Agricultural stability equals population stability. And stable populations don't starve as easily. One of the most impressive examples, the Proserpina Dam in Spain, still stands today, which is mildly embarrassing for some modern infrastructure projects that retire after 30 years with dramatic cracks. Roman dams allowed cities to grow in areas that would otherwise have been too dry or too volatile. Water storage changes everything. It allows surplus. Surplus allows trade. Trade allows resilience during bad seasons. You see the pattern. The Romans understood that water is both life and threat. So instead of praying harder, they engineered harder. And that's a survival mindset. They didn't eliminate natural disaster. They mitigated it. They reduced volatility. Because volatility kills. Controlled water means controlled agriculture. Controlled agriculture means controlled food supply. Controlled food supply means fewer riots, fewer famines, fewer collapses. And here's the subtle genius part. Dams are not glamorous. They do not shout. They just sit there, holding back disaster quietly. Which is exactly what you want from something that could otherwise wipe out your civilization. So while generals were busy conquering provinces, Roman engineers were standing in rivers thinking, what if we just told the water to stay put? And somehow, it listened. Sometimes saving humanity isn't about fighting enemies. It's about negotiating with gravity and water until they behave. And the Romans were very good negotiators. Now let's shift from water control to something far more fragile: the human body. Before Rome systematized military medicine, battlefield injuries were often handled with a combination of basic bandaging, hopeful prayer, and, well, that's unfortunate. The Romans decided that wasn't efficient, so they created the valetudinarium, essentially an early version of a military hospital. These were not chaotic tents with someone waving herbs around. They were structured facilities built inside permanent forts, designed specifically for treating wounded soldiers. There were separate rooms for patients, designated surgical areas, storage spaces for medical tools, even drainage systems to keep things cleaner than most cities at the time. And here's why this matters beyond military logistics. Organized medical care increases survival rates dramatically. When wounded soldiers are treated quickly, they recover faster. They return to duty. They don't die from infections that could have been prevented with basic wound cleaning. Roman medical practitioners used surgical instruments that were surprisingly advanced: scalpels, forceps, bone drills. They cleaned wounds with vinegar and boiling water. Not sterile by modern standards, but significantly better than "let's ignore it." The valetudinarium represented something new: medicine as infrastructure. It wasn't just about having a skilled physician nearby. It was about creating a system where treatment was expected, organized, and repeatable. That changes survival odds. And not just for soldiers. Medical knowledge developed in military contexts often spreads into civilian life. Techniques improve, tools evolve, standards rise. When a society formalizes healthcare, even in limited contexts, it reduces mortality across generations. Rome's armies weren't powerful just because of discipline or tactics. They were powerful because wounded soldiers had a chance to live. And that chance matters. The valetudinarium doesn't look heroic. It doesn't conquer cities. It just quietly increases the number of people who wake up the next morning. And that's the definition of life-saving. So while emperors were busy carving their names into marble, Roman doctors were stitching people back together in structured stone buildings. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And sometimes civilization survives not because it fights harder, but because it heals better. Let's talk about something that quietly prevents societal chaos: money that people actually trust. Before standardized coinage became widespread, trade often relied on barter systems. You want grain? I want goats. You don't have goats? Well, now we have a problem. Bartering works in small villages. It collapses in large empires. The Romans understood that economic stability is survival, so they standardized coinage across vast territories. Gold, silver, bronze, minted with consistent weight and recognizable markings. This did two important things. First, it reduced transaction confusion. If a Roman coin had a known value across the empire, trade became smoother. You didn't need a livestock negotiation every time you wanted bread. Second, it increased trust. Trust is the invisible backbone of survival. If merchants trust currency, trade flourishes. If trade flourishes, food moves across regions. If food moves across regions, famine impact decreases. A drought in one province doesn't automatically become mass starvation if another province can supply grain. Standardized currency also made taxation predictable. And predictable taxation funds infrastructure. Infrastructure reduces collapse. See how this keeps looping back to systems? The Roman denarius wasn't just a shiny object with an emperor's face. It was a stabilizing mechanism. It allowed complex economic networks to function at scale. And scale matters. Because the larger and more interconnected an economy is, the more resilient it becomes during crisis. When famine hits, wealth can redirect resources. When disasters strike, funds can rebuild. Without reliable currency, economic panic spreads fast. With it, societies absorb shocks better. Of course, Rome did eventually experience inflation issues when emperors got a little too creative with silver content. But at its peak, Roman monetary standardization allowed a massive empire to function economically without constant barter-induced arguments. And that's not trivial, because economic instability kills quietly. It starves populations. It fuels unrest. It collapses governments. Stable currency prevents that domino effect. So while Roman roads connected cities physically, standardized coinage connected them economically. And economic connection is survival. Because sometimes humanity isn't saved by swords. It's saved by everyone agreeing that this small metal disc actually means something. Now here's an invention that sounds painfully bureaucratic, but quietly life-saving. The census. Yes, paperwork. Rome regularly conducted censuses to count its citizens, assess property, and determine military and tax obligations. It sounds administrative. It sounds dry. It sounds like something that belongs in a very boring meeting. But counting people changes how a society functions. If you don't know how many people live in your territory, you cannot plan effectively. You cannot allocate grain properly. You cannot organize defense accurately. You cannot build infrastructure at the right scale. You are guessing. And guessing in large populations leads to shortages. Shortages lead to unrest. Unrest leads to collapse. The Roman census allowed the state to understand its own size. It created a data-driven approach to governance long before the phrase data-driven became annoying. If a region had grown rapidly, more resources could be directed there. If another region declined, adjustments could be made. This improved food distribution systems. It improved taxation fairness. It improved military organization. And here's the subtle survival factor: accountability. When citizens are counted, they exist in the system. They are recognized as part of the state's structure. That recognition makes large-scale organization possible. Censuses also allowed Rome to plan urban development. If you know how many people are living in a city, you can better plan water supply, grain storage, and housing. Without population data, cities either underprepare or overextend. Both are dangerous. Underpreparation causes famine and disease. Overextension causes infrastructure collapse. Rome's census was not about curiosity. It was about control. And control, when applied to logistics, stabilizes societies. Of course, it also made tax collection very efficient, which was less exciting for the average Roman citizen. But from a survival standpoint, organized governance increases longevity. Empires that cannot measure themselves tend to implode. Rome measured everything: population, property, military capacity. And while that may sound like paperwork obsession, it prevented chaos at scale. Because when you count people, you can plan for them. And when you plan for them, they are more likely to survive. So yes, sometimes humanity is saved not by grand monuments, but by someone writing numbers on a wax tablet and taking it very seriously. Now let's talk about information. Because if infrastructure is the skeleton of civilization, information is the nervous system. And the Romans understood something critical. Rumors spread faster than armies. To counter misinformation and keep citizens informed, Rome created the Acta Diurna, essentially a daily public bulletin carved or written on stone or metal and displayed in public spaces. Think of it as the ancient version of a newspaper, without pop-up ads. The Acta Diurna included announcements of laws, military victories, court decisions, public events, even executions. It wasn't gossip, it was official communication, and that matters. When information flows clearly, panic decreases. When citizens understand new laws, they adapt instead of rebel. When trade announcements are public, merchants plan better. When public health warnings circulate, communities respond. Information transparency stabilizes societies. Before structured communication systems, news traveled through word of mouth. And word of mouth is creative. It exaggerates. It distorts. That distortion can cause riots. Rome minimized that risk by making state information visible and standardized. You could literally walk through the forum and read what was happening in your government. Now imagine living in a massive empire without any centralized communication. No official updates. No clarity on leadership changes or legal reforms. Confusion spreads. Confusion leads to unrest. Unrest threatens survival. The Acta Diurna helped reduce that. It wasn't democratic by modern standards. It was controlled communication. But controlled communication is still better than chaotic rumor networks when your goal is societal stability. It also created historical records. Written information preserved events for future generations. That preservation strengthens institutional memory. And institutional memory prevents repeated mistakes. Sometimes. So while emperors were busy making dramatic speeches, clerks were chiseling announcements into stone. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't conquer provinces. But it reduced uncertainty. And uncertainty destabilizes civilizations faster than almost anything else. The Acta Diurna proves that saving humanity isn't always about building stronger walls. Sometimes it's about making sure everyone knows what's going on, because informed societies survive better than confused ones. Even in togas, we already talked about aqueducts. But here's the part people forget. The Romans didn't just build them, they maintained them. And that distinction may have saved more lives than the arches themselves. See, building infrastructure is impressive. Maintaining it is discipline. Rome established official positions, like the curator aquarum, whose entire job was overseeing the water supply. There were inspectors, repair crews, and regulations protecting aqueducts from illegal tapping. Yes, ancient water theft was a thing, and Rome took it seriously. Because clean water is only life-saving if it stays clean. Aqueduct channels were regularly inspected for cracks. Mineral buildup was cleared. Structural weaknesses were reinforced before collapse happened. Preventive maintenance. 2,000 years ago. This reduced contamination risk. It prevented catastrophic breaks that would cut off entire cities from water. It ensured that public fountains and baths kept flowing reliably. And reliability is everything. When water systems fail, disease spreads fast. Panic follows, migration increases, cities destabilize. Rome understood that once you build a life-saving system, you protect it aggressively. They even had laws regulating water distribution, ensuring priority access for public fountains before private homes. Public need first. That's strategic governance. Because if the public water supply fails, the entire population suffers. If a private villa runs dry, well, tragic for them. The Romans also engineered overflow systems to prevent damage during heavy rain, which means they planned for failure, they expected stress, and they built safeguards. This mindset is what separates flashy empires from durable ones. It's easy to celebrate aqueduct construction. It's harder to celebrate routine inspections. But inspections prevent collapse, and collapse prevention is survival. The aqueduct maintenance system shows something profound about Roman thinking. Infrastructure is not a one-time achievement. It is an ongoing responsibility. That philosophy allowed Roman cities to thrive for centuries, because systems that are maintained don't suddenly fail. They endure. And sometimes the real invention isn't the structure itself. It's the idea that you must keep fixing it before it breaks. That quiet discipline may have saved more lives than the aqueduct arches ever did. And that's a very Roman kind of genius. Now let's cross something. Literally. Before reliable bridges, rivers were seasonal obstacles. In dry months, maybe you waded across. In rainy months, you waited, or risked it. And risked it often meant losing cargo, animals, or people to very committed water currents. Rome decided that waiting for rivers to cooperate was inefficient. So they built permanent bridges, not temporary wooden platforms that collapsed during the first serious storm. Stone bridges, engineered with arches, foundations sunk deep into riverbeds, reinforced piers designed to split the current instead of fighting it. That design detail matters. Instead of resisting water directly, Roman bridge piers were shaped to reduce pressure from flowing currents. Water moved around them smoothly, decreasing structural stress, which meant fewer collapses. And fewer collapses mean fewer trade interruptions. Bridges do more than connect land. They connect food supply chains. If a harvest in one region can cross a river quickly, famine risk decreases in another region. If medical supplies can move during flood season, mortality drops. If communication travels without delay, crises are resolved faster. Bridges shorten response time. Response time saves lives. Rome built bridges across major rivers like the Tiber, the Danube, and throughout their provinces. Many remained functional for centuries. Some are still standing. Think about that. 2,000 years of resisting floods, ice, and time. Modern infrastructure occasionally struggles with a decade. Permanent crossings reduce isolation. Isolation is dangerous. Isolated communities struggle during crop failures, disease outbreaks, or invasions. Connected communities redistribute resources. Rome's bridges created economic arteries. They allowed empire-wide trade to function year-round, and when trade functions year-round, populations stabilize. But here's the subtle genius. Bridges also reduce psychological barriers. They shrink perceived distance. They make travel normal. Normalized movement increases cooperation, and cooperation increases resilience. The Roman bridge wasn't dramatic. It didn't roar. It just quietly allowed carts, soldiers, merchants, and civilians to cross without asking permission from the river. And that consistency changed survival math. Because when your infrastructure refuses to be seasonal, your civilization refuses to be fragile. Sometimes saving humanity is as simple as saying, we're not waiting for the water to calm down, we're building over it. Now let's leave the rivers and head to the sea. Because if bridges connect land, lighthouses protect everything moving between it. The Romans didn't invent the lighthouse. The famous Pharos of Alexandria existed before them. But the Romans adopted, replicated, and standardized lighthouse construction across their empire. And that mattered more than you might think. Ancient maritime trade was not a casual hobby. It was the backbone of food distribution. Rome depended heavily on grain shipments from North Africa and Egypt. If those ships didn't arrive, the city didn't eat. And when Rome didn't eat, Rome rioted. The Mediterranean can be unpredictable. Storms, fog, rocky coastlines. Ships approaching harbours at night faced real danger. So the Romans built lighthouses at major ports. Stone towers with fires burning at the top, visible from miles away. Simple concept, massive impact. A visible beacon reduces shipwrecks. Fewer shipwrecks mean more reliable grain supply. More reliable grain supply means fewer famines. Less famine means less unrest. Unrest destabilizes empires. You see the chain reaction. The lighthouse doesn't fight storms. It guides ships through them, and guidance prevents disaster. Roman lighthouses were strategically placed at high-risk harbours. Some even included reflective surfaces to amplify the firelight, increasing visibility. Because losing ships wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an economic threat. Cargo lost at sea meant lost resources, lost revenue, lost stability. Reliable maritime navigation created consistent trade networks. Trade networks reduce regional isolation. Isolated regions starve during crisis. Connected regions adapt. And here's the quiet genius part. The lighthouse doesn't move. It doesn't conquer. It simply stands there, burning consistently, night after night. It's the ultimate symbol of preventative engineering. You don't notice it when things go well. You only notice it when it's missing. And that's the theme of so many Roman innovations. They prevented disaster quietly. They reduced risk before catastrophe struck. Because the smartest way to save humanity isn't always to rescue it dramatically. Sometimes it's to make sure the ship doesn't crash in the first place. All because someone decided that fire, placed high enough, could mean survival. And that's a very Roman solution. Now let's talk about speed. Not gladiator speed. Not chariot racing speed. Information speed. The Romans created the cursus publicus, an official state-run postal and courier system that allowed messages to travel across the empire with surprising efficiency. This wasn't a random guy on a horse hoping for the best. It was organized. Relay stations were placed along major roads. Fresh horses were available at intervals. Couriers carried official documents with authorization seals, allowing them to move quickly and with priority. Which means news could travel hundreds of miles in days instead of weeks. And that changes survival math dramatically. If a frontier province is attacked, the capital knows faster. If a famine begins in one region, grain shipments can be redirected sooner. If disease spreads, warnings can move ahead of it. Delayed communication causes slow response. Slow response causes collapse. Fast communication reduces damage. The Roman postal system didn't just deliver letters. It delivered coordination. And coordination is what keeps large systems from breaking apart. Imagine managing an empire stretching across continents without a reliable communication network. Governors would act independently. Decisions would conflict. Resources would be misallocated. Chaos grows in silence. Rome minimized that silence. By ensuring that messages moved predictably and efficiently, they strengthened administrative control. They reduced uncertainty between provinces. And uncertainty destabilizes societies. The cursus publicus also helped standardize information. Orders were written, sealed, and traceable. That reduced misunderstandings and prevented rumor-based governance. Because rumor is fast, but organized speed is faster. The system required infrastructure, maintained roads, relay stations, official oversight. Again, it wasn't flashy, it was systemic, and systemic thinking prevents fragmentation. When regions stay connected to the center, unity lasts longer, and unity increases survival probability. The Roman postal system reminds us that sometimes the difference between stability and collapse is not military strength, it's response time. Because if help arrives too late, it doesn't matter how powerful you are. The Romans understood that empire isn't just about conquering territory. It's about keeping that territory informed, and informed territories survive longer than isolated ones. All because someone decided that horses, placed strategically, could hold civilization together, which, in a way, they did. Now here's something the Romans rarely get credit for. They built backups, not metaphorical backups. Actual physical redundancy. Multiple aqueducts feeding the same city. Multiple grain sources supplying the same population. Multiple roads connecting the same regions. If one failed, another carried the load. That mindset may have saved more lives than any single invention. Take Rome itself. The city wasn't dependent on one aqueduct. It had several. If one was damaged during war or earthquake, water didn't immediately disappear. That's resilience. If one grain shipment was delayed, another province could compensate. That's redundancy. Redundancy reduces catastrophic failure. In fragile systems, one weak point collapses everything. In redundant systems, failure is absorbed, and absorbed failure prevents panic. Panic destabilizes societies. Rome's infrastructure often overlapped deliberately. Roads intersected, supply chains overlapped, administrative roles had deputies, even military command structures were layered. It wasn't about optimism, it was about expectation. The Romans expected things to go wrong. Floods happen, roads erode, crops fail, governors die. So they built alternatives, and alternatives reduce risk. Modern engineering calls this risk mitigation. Rome called it common sense. This approach allowed the empire to survive shocks that would have crippled less organized societies. When disaster struck, Rome didn't collapse immediately. It rerouted. That ability to reroute is survival, because civilization doesn't end when something breaks. It ends when nothing else can compensate. The Romans rarely relied on a single lifeline. They created networks, and networks distribute stress. That philosophy extends beyond physical infrastructure. Legal systems overlapped with local customs. Military garrisons reinforced provinces. Administrative hierarchies layered authority. Everything had backup, and backup prevents catastrophe. The quiet genius of Rome wasn't just innovation, it was preparation. They didn't assume perfection, they assumed failure, and they planned for it, which may be the most life-saving invention of all, because if your system only works when everything goes perfectly, it won't last long. Rome lasted centuries not because nothing went wrong, but because when it did there was always another arch, another road, another aqueduct waiting to carry the weight, and that's how you keep humanity standing. We've talked about arches, heated floors, glass windows, hospitals, dams, bridges, postal systems, and backup infrastructure. Now let's zoom out, because Rome's final quiet invention wasn't a structure, it was a habit, standardization. The Romans standardized everything. brick sizes, road widths, military equipment, legal procedures, currency weights, measurements. And while that sounds deeply unexciting, it may be the most life-saving mindset of them all. Standardization reduces confusion. If every brick is the same size, buildings go up faster and fail less often. If every road follows similar construction principles, maintenance becomes predictable. If military gear is standardized, repairs are easier and supply chains run smoother. If legal processes are consistent, disputes don't spiral into violence as quickly. Standardization makes systems boring. And boring systems are stable systems. Imagine trying to maintain an empire where every region uses different measurements, different road designs, different legal definitions, different coin weights. That's not diversity. That's logistical collapse, waiting patiently. Rome reduced friction by making components interchangeable. Interchangeability is powerful. If something breaks, you replace it without redesigning the entire system. That reduces downtime. Reduced downtime means fewer shortages, fewer delays, fewer crises. Even their military camps were standardized. Rectangular layouts, predictable street grids, identical positioning of key structures, which meant camps could be built quickly and dismantled efficiently. Speed and predictability save lives in conflict. But this philosophy extended to civilian life too. Standard weights and measures improved trade fairness. Standardized construction reduced structural risk. Standardized governance reduced arbitrary decisions. And arbitrary systems fail faster than consistent ones. Rome's true genius wasn't inventing everything. It was refining, organizing, and making systems repeatable. Repeatability is survival. Because when systems are predictable, they are manageable, and manageable societies last longer. The Romans made complexity organized. They made expansion structured. They made chaos slightly more boring. And boring stability is what keeps people alive. Empires fall, roads erode, concrete cracks. But the Roman instinct to standardize? That instinct still shapes modern civilization. And that might be the simplest Roman invention that saved humanity. The decision to make survival systematic, quietly, relentlessly, and very, very organized. In Renaissance Florence, beauty was not about looking healthy. It was about looking heavenly. The ideal woman did not glow with vitality. She glowed with pallor. Painters like Sandro Botticelli immortalized women with skin so pale it looked carved from marble. The message was clear. If you were tan, you worked. If you were pale, you were privileged. Sunlight was for peasants. Ivory skin was for angels and aristocrats. And so began the ritual. Women applied white lead powder, often mixed with vinegar, directly onto their faces. The mixture created a smooth, opaque mask that erased freckles, scars, and any inconvenient signs of humanity. At first, it worked beautifully. Skin looked flawless, ethereal, almost unreal. That was the problem. It was unreal. Lead seeps through the skin. Slowly. Quietly. It poisons the body over time. Women who chased that divine glow often experienced headaches, tremors, hair loss, and skin that deteriorated beneath the very powder meant to perfect it. Ironically, the more the skin worsened, the more powder they applied. The solution to damaged skin was more damage. Some women developed sores that refused to heal. Others suffered muscle weakness or early death. But in a society where marriage prospects depended heavily on appearance, the risk felt worth it. A smooth face could secure a powerful husband. A powerful husband could secure survival. A little poisoning seemed like a reasonable trade. Men were not entirely innocent either. Courtiers and noblemen sometimes dusted their own faces for that refined, aristocratic look. Nothing says power quite like slowly intoxicated elegance. The true tragedy is that the damage was gradual. There was no dramatic collapse in the ballroom, just a slow decline hidden behind layers of cosmetic perfection. Beauty demanded sacrifice, and in Renaissance Florence, sacrifice occasionally meant your nervous system. Looking divine came at a cost, and sometimes that cost was written in lead. In the end, the Renaissance pursuit of flawless skin reveals something timeless. Fashion convinces us that suffering is sophisticated, that if something hurts, it must be working. And 500 years later, the mirror still wins more arguments than common sense. If poison was acceptable for pale skin, then tweezers were practically harmless. Or so they thought. In Renaissance Italy, particularly in cities like Florence and Venice, the ideal female face was not framed by a thick, expressive hairline. Quite the opposite. A high forehead was considered the height of elegance. It suggested intelligence, nobility, serenity, the kind of calm composure you might expect from a Madonna painted by Leonardo da Vinci. The problem? Most people are born with hairlines that stubbornly exist, so women simply removed them. Hair along the forehead was plucked, strand by painful strand, to artificially raise the hairline. Eyebrows often followed. A smooth, expansive forehead became a blank canvas of aristocratic perfection. The larger the visible brow area, the closer one appeared to artistic ideals circulating in portraits and frescoes. This was not a one-time effort. Hair grows back, which meant regular maintenance, hours of plucking, sometimes assisted by corrosive pastes made from quicklime or arsenic compounds, to permanently weaken hair growth. Because if you are going to suffer, you might as well suffer efficiently. The consequences were predictable: inflamed skin, scarring, infections, chemical burns, and in extreme cases, long-term damage to the scalp. But in a culture obsessed with symbolic beauty, the forehead was not just skin. It was status. A high forehead suggested refinement. It implied that you were thoughtful, controlled, above crude physical labor. Ironically, achieving this natural look required a level of discomfort that bordered on medieval torture, all in pursuit of appearing effortlessly composed. Men participated too, though less dramatically. Some adopted carefully groomed hairlines to mirror classical statues. The Renaissance adored ancient Rome and Greece, and classical busts often featured idealized structured hairlines. If marble gods looked that way, humans would try. There is something deeply human about this ritual, the desire to reshape the body to match art, to erase what nature provided in favor of what culture applauded. And so, in candle-lit rooms across Florence, women leaned into mirrors, methodically erasing their own hairlines, proving once again that fashion does not ask whether something is sensible. It only asks whether it is admired. If the face was about illusion, the body was about discipline. Renaissance fashion did not believe in comfort, it believed in structure. In cities like Florence and Milan, the fashionable silhouette for noble women emphasized a narrow waist, lifted posture, and a rigid, elongated torso. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. Elegance requires control, preferably painful control. Enter the corset. Early Renaissance corsetry was not yet the extreme hourglass torture device of later centuries, but it was still unforgiving. Stiffened with wood, whalebone, or tightly layered linen, these bodices compressed the torso into an upright, immovable column. Slouching was physically impossible. Breathing deeply? Also optional. The corset created a smooth line under elaborate gowns. It flattened the stomach, lifted the chest, and reshaped the ribs over time. Yes, over time. Because when you bind something long enough, the body adapts. Bones shift, muscles weaken, organs politely relocate. Women wore these garments for hours at a time, during banquets, church services, court appearances, and long social gatherings where fainting was not uncommon. A sudden loss of air could be mistaken for delicate femininity. In reality, it was often just oxygen deprivation. Doctors of the period occasionally warned about excessive tightness, but fashion rarely listens to medical advice. A slim waist symbolized youth and refinement. It suggested that the woman did not engage in manual labor. that she belonged to a world of tapestries, not toil. There was also a moral dimension. A structured body was thought to reflect a structured soul. Discipline in dress equaled discipline in character. A rigid torso implied virtue, which is fascinating because nothing says moral superiority like mild internal compression. Even young girls were introduced to structured bodices early, training their posture before their bodies had fully developed. The aesthetic ideal was learned, enforced, and laced tightly into place. From the outside, Renaissance portraits radiate calm poise, upright figures, graceful hands, serene expressions. But beneath those velvet gowns and embroidered sleeves, ribs pressed inward and lungs negotiated for space. Beauty, once again, demanded sacrifice. And in this case, it asked politely, then pulled the laces tighter. If Renaissance beauty aimed to look divine, it also needed to smell divine, or at least not alarming. Cities like Venice were magnificent, shimmering canals, marble palaces, bustling markets filled with silk and spice. They were also crowded, humid, and burdened with the subtle fragrance of open drains, livestock, and humanity living very close together. Bathing was complicated. Public bathhouses had declined after plague outbreaks, and many people believed excessive bathing opened the pores to disease. Water, suspiciously, was considered risky. Dirt, apparently, was negotiable. So instead of washing frequently, Renaissance elites turned to perfume. Venice became a centre for luxury fragrances, importing exotic ingredients from the East through vast trade networks. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, and musk arrived via merchants who crossed paths with the Ottoman world. Aromatic resins, rosewater, ambergris, and civet were blended into oils and pomanders, small decorative containers filled with scented materials that could be worn or carried. These perfumes did more than mask body odour. They signalled wealth. Imported scent meant global connections. It meant power. If you smelled like rose and sandalwood instead of canal and cabbage, you were winning. However, some ingredients came with complications. Civet, for instance, was derived from the glands of small mammals. Ambergris came from the digestive system of sperm whales. Musk was extracted from deer. Renaissance perfume was essentially a luxury blend of flowers and animal byproducts. Nothing says refinement like distilled glandular secretion. Perfumes were applied generously, on gloves, on hair, on clothing. Some people even soaked handkerchiefs in fragrance and held them to their noses while walking through crowded streets. This was not vanity. It was survival. Ironically, heavily perfumed clothing layered over rarely washed garments created its own olfactory complexity. Sweat mingled with spice, musk mixed with damp velvet. The result was less heavenly garden and more ambitious attempt. Still, scent carried symbolic power. Sweet aromas were associated with purity and health. Bad smells were linked to disease. In a world still shaped by miasma theory, the belief that illness spread through foul air, perfume felt protective. And so, Renaissance nobles marched through narrow Venetian alleys, trailing clouds of imported fragrance, battling both bacteria and embarrassment with scented confidence. Because if you could not eliminate the smell, you could at least overwhelm it, preferably with something that travelled halfway across the world to meet your neck. If pale skin and structured waists signalled refinement, the eyes were where true power lived. Renaissance beauty ideals favoured large, luminous eyes, wide, soft, and slightly glassy, the kind of gaze that made you look contemplative, romantic, possibly touched by divine inspiration. Artists across Italy emphasized bright, expressive eyes in portraits, reinforcing the idea that beauty radiated from the gaze. And if your eyes did not naturally cooperate, there were solutions, questionable ones. One popular cosmetic involved drops made from belladonna, a plant whose name literally means beautiful woman in Italian. The plant contains atropine, a compound that dilates the pupils. Larger pupils make the eyes appear darker, shinier, and more alluring. The effect is subtle, but striking. Suddenly your gaze looks intense, hypnotic, almost theatrical. The problem is that belladonna is poisonous. A few drops could blur vision for hours. Repeated use could lead to light sensitivity, chronic eye damage, or even blindness. But in candlelit salons and private chambers, temporary blindness was apparently a reasonable exchange for dramatic allure. And belladonna was not alone. Arsenic-based preparations were sometimes used to lighten skin or remove blemishes. In small doses, arsenic can create a faintly translucent complexion, at least at first, but arsenic accumulates in the body. Long-term exposure leads to skin lesions, organ damage, and eventually death. Renaissance cosmetic culture existed in a strange tension between art and alchemy. Apothecaries sold beauty treatments alongside medicinal remedies. The line between healing and harming was thin, and often poorly understood. Women were not entirely naive. Many recipes circulated in handwritten beauty manuals, passed quietly among noble households. Some warned about dosage. Others offered elaborate instructions to purify toxic ingredients. But the underlying truth remained. Achieving an otherworldly look sometimes required substances that were, quite literally, otherworldly in their danger. The irony is almost poetic. The Renaissance celebrated humanism, reason, and rediscovery of classical knowledge. Yet in private, women willingly placed poison in their eyes to meet aesthetic expectations shaped by painters and poets. Looking divine meant risk. Looking captivating meant chemistry. And sometimes, the pursuit of a brighter gaze dimmed the world permanently. If Renaissance beauty harmed quietly through powders and drops, fashion harmed more directly, by sheer physical weight. In cities like Florence and Venice, clothing was not just fabric, it was architecture. Noble women wore layers upon layers, linen chemises, stiff bodices, heavy velvet gowns, embroidered overdresses, fur-lined cloaks, and elaborate sleeves that could be detached and reattached depending on the occasion. Dressing was less getting ready and more being assembled. Velvet was particularly prized. Imported silk threads and rich dyes made it luxurious and expensive. Deep reds, royal blues, and shimmering gold embroidery signaled wealth instantly. The richer the fabric, the louder the statement. You were not just present, you were financially undeniable. But velvet is heavy. A fully dressed Renaissance noblewoman might carry several kilograms of fabric on her body. Add jewellery, gold chains, gemstone pendants, rings, and the total weight could rival a modest suit of armour. Standing for long ceremonies, walking through narrow stone streets, climbing staircases in palaces, all of it became a slow, deliberate process. Movement was restricted. Gowns were structured to encourage short, measured steps. Running was out of the question. Even sitting required careful arrangement of fabric to avoid crushing the silhouette. Grace was not natural, it was engineered by limitation. Then there were the sleeves. Renaissance fashion adored exaggerated sleeves, puffed, slashed, layered, and sometimes stuffed to create volume. They looked magnificent in portraits. In daily life, they caught on doorways, brushed through candle flames, and collected dust from every surface they touched. Fire hazards were not theoretical in an era of open flames. Sumptuary laws attempted to regulate who could wear what. Governments in Italian city-states passed rules limiting certain fabrics and colours to specific social classes. Clothing was political. It declared your rank before you spoke, and so women carried their status literally on their shoulders. The weight of silk and velvet became a symbol of prestige. Discomfort was reframed as dignity. The result? Portraits show serene, immobile figures draped in luxurious stillness. What they do not show is the muscle fatigue, the restricted breathing beneath layers, the quiet endurance required to appear effortlessly magnificent. In Renaissance fashion, elegance was measured not only in beauty, but in how much weight you could carry without complaint. If pale skin signaled nobility, golden hair signaled something even higher, almost mythic beauty. Across Renaissance Italy, particularly in Venice, blonde hair became intensely fashionable. Artists painted women with shimmering, sunlit locks cascading over embroidered gowns. Fair hair was associated with youth, purity, and divine radiance. If angels had hair, surely it was golden. Unfortunately, not everyone was born angelic, so women improvised. To lighten their hair, they applied chemical mixtures containing alum, sulfur, and sometimes mercury-based compounds. Yes, mercury, the same substance that can quietly dismantle your nervous system. The paste would be spread onto the hair before sitting for hours in direct sunlight, often on rooftops. Special wide-brimmed hats with open tops were designed to protect the face from tanning while exposing the hair to the sun. Beauty required precision. The sun would activate the mixture, gradually bleaching the strands into a fashionable honey tone. The process worked, but at a cost. Hair became brittle, dry, and prone to breakage, scalps burned, skin blistered, and repeated exposure to mercury could lead to tremors, mood changes, and long-term health problems. But golden hair was worth it. Blonde was not just a colour. It was a status symbol. It suggested leisure, time to sit under the sun performing elaborate treatments. It suggested proximity to artistic ideals seen in paintings and poetry. Dark hair might have been natural, but gold was aspirational. Venetian women became especially associated with this look. Travellers described the sight of noble women seated on terraces, hair spread out in the sunlight like offerings to the sky. It was almost ritualistic, a public display of private transformation. Ironically, Italy's climate naturally produced a range of darker shades. The blonde ideal was imported, influenced by Northern European beauty standards and classical imagery. Renaissance culture admired antiquity deeply, and statues of Greek goddesses, though originally painted, were imagined as pale and fair. The lengths people will go to for fashion rarely change. In the 16th century, it meant baking your chemically treated hair in the Mediterranean sun, while hoping your scalp survived the process. The result might shimmer beautifully in a portrait. But behind every golden curl was a quiet chemistry experiment, and sometimes a very irritated nervous system. Not every Renaissance beauty secret involved poison or compression. Some were subtler, strategic, almost theatrical. Perfect skin was the ultimate canvas, but real skin, inconveniently, contains scars, blemishes, pockmarks, and uneven tones. And in a century still haunted by outbreaks of disease, especially smallpox, facial scarring was common. Illness did not care about aesthetics, so fashion adapted. Women began using small fabric patches, often made of silk or velvet, to cover imperfections. These beauty spots were cut into decorative shapes: circles, stars, crescent moons, even tiny hearts. Placed carefully on the cheek, near the lip, or beside the eye, they concealed scars while creating the illusion of intentional ornamentation. It was camouflage disguised as charm. In cities like Florence and Venice, these patches could even carry coded meaning. Placement mattered. A spot near the mouth might suggest flirtation. One near the eye could imply mystery. Beauty became semiotic, a language written directly onto the face. And because subtlety was rarely enough, patches were often combined with heavy powder, rouge made from crushed cochineal insects, and tinted lip salves. The result was a carefully curated illusion of vitality layered over very real human vulnerability. There was, of course, risk. Adhesives used to attach these patches were not always gentle. Some were made from animal glue or plant resins that irritated sensitive skin. Applied daily, removed nightly, reapplied again. The process could inflame the very skin it attempted to beautify. Yet the psychological effect was powerful. A scar was no longer a reminder of disease. It became an accessory, a blemish turned into a focal point. The Renaissance adored symbolism. Artists filled canvases with allegory and coded messages. It seems only fitting that faces followed the same rule, every detail intentional, every imperfection rebranded. There is something almost modern about this technique, the transformation of flaw into feature. the understanding that perception can be shaped through clever design. But beneath the velvet patch and powdered cheeks, the reality remained unchanged. Disease, age, and nature could not be erased, only redirected. In Renaissance beauty culture, even scars could be curated, because when perfection is impossible, illusion becomes an art form. If pale skin suggested nobility, it also risked suggesting something else: fragility, illness, imminent collapse. So while women powdered themselves into marble statues, they simultaneously needed a touch of life, a hint of warmth in the cheeks to prove they were not actually fading into the afterlife. Enter rouge. Renaissance rouge was often made from crushed cochineal insects, producing a rich red pigment. Mixed with fats or oils, it could be dabbed onto cheeks and lips to simulate a natural flush. The goal was subtle vitality, a delicate bloom of health against the carefully engineered pallor. But subtlety is subjective. Too much rouge, and you risked looking theatrical. Too little, and you looked ghostly. The balance was delicate, like trying to appear naturally radiant while covered in heavy metal powder. And then there was bloodletting. Yes, in a period still guided by humoral theory, the belief that health depended on balancing bodily fluids, controlled bloodletting was considered medicinal. Removing excess blood was thought to restore equilibrium. Physicians prescribed it for headaches, fevers, even general malaise. The irony? A woman might powder her face pale, paint her cheeks red, and then voluntarily lose blood in the name of wellness. Fashion and medicine were entangled in a way that blurred logic. Some even believed that bloodletting improved complexion by preventing internal overheating. The body, in Renaissance thinking, was a system of delicate balances. Too much heat, too much moisture, too much bile, all of it could manifest in the skin. So vitality was performed. A painted flush symbolized youth and fertility. In courtly culture, rosy cheeks suggested passion restrained by decorum. It was carefully managed intensity. Alive, but controlled. Men participated too, though often more subtly. A healthy flush was associated with strength and virility, but for women, the stakes were higher. Beauty influenced marriage prospects, alliances, and family honor. The performance of health became a daily ritual, pale enough to signal privilege, rosy enough to signal life, balanced carefully between saint and seductress. From a distance, Renaissance portraits radiate serene vitality, soft color in the cheeks, luminous skin, composed expressions. What they rarely show is the choreography behind it. Powders layered over skin, pigments dabbed precisely, and occasionally a physician waiting nearby with a basin. Because in the Renaissance, even looking alive required planning. By the spring of 1453, the ancient city of Constantinople was no longer the glittering capital it once had been. It was tired, thinned out, surrounded. For more than 1,000 years these walls had held. Built under Theodosius II, the massive triple-layered defences had repelled Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Rus. They were considered nearly invincible, a stone declaration that the Roman Empire, at least in the east, would endure. But empires age. By the time Constantine XI Palaiologos took the throne, the so-called Eastern Roman Empire had shrunk to little more than the city itself and a few scattered territories. Once it commanded the Mediterranean. Now it struggled to fill its own battlements with soldiers. Across the strait, a young sultan prepared to change history. Mehmed II was barely in his early 20s, but he carried an ambition far older than himself. He did not merely want the city, he wanted legitimacy. He wanted to be Caesar. To capture Constantinople was to claim the mantle of Rome itself. He assembled a massive army, seasoned janissaries, Anatolian infantry, Balkan levies, and most ominously, he brought something the walls had never faced before in such scale: colossal cannons. Inside the city, tension thickened. Constantine XI knew reinforcements from Western Europe would be limited. Some Genoese and Venetian fighters arrived, most notably the skilled commander Giovanni Giustiniani. But the Christian powers of Europe were divided, distracted, cautious. The schism between Eastern Orthodoxy and Western Catholicism still lingered like a wound. On the eve of the siege, the emperor walked the walls. Imagine him there, not as a distant symbol, but as a man, a ruler of a fading empire, staring at campfires stretching across the horizon. He knew the odds. He knew the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. The city had survived for centuries. But this time, the enemy did not just bring swords. He brought thunder. Thunder arrived in iron. When Mehmed II prepared to take Constantinople, he understood something crucial. The city's legendary walls were not invincible. They were simply old, and old stone, however proud, could crack. To make them crack, he turned to a Hungarian engineer named Orban. Orban had once offered his services to the Byzantines, claiming he could build cannons powerful enough to shatter any wall. But Constantinople, strapped for money, could not afford him. Mehmed could. What Orban built was monstrous. The largest bombard required dozens of oxen to transport, and hundreds of men to position. Its barrel was so wide that a grown man could crawl inside. Each stone cannonball weighed hundreds of kilograms. Firing, it was not a casual event. It was a ritual of preparation, timing, and controlled chaos. When the first shot roared across the fields in April 1453, the sound was unlike anything the defenders had heard before. It was not the whistle of arrows or the crash of siege towers. It was a deep, concussive explosion that rolled through the air and struck the Theodosian walls with brutal force. Stone splintered. Dust rose. Centuries of confidence trembled. The cannons did not fire constantly. They overheated. They cracked. They had to cool and be repaired. But each blast carved wounds into fortifications that had once seemed eternal. Between bombardments, Ottoman soldiers rushed forward to widen breaches. Byzantine defenders scrambled to fill gaps with rubble, timber, and desperate manpower. Inside the city, morale wavered. People had believed in the walls almost as a matter of faith. They were physical proof of divine favour. Now, that faith was being chipped away, one thunderous impact at a time. Mehmed himself watched closely. He was not reckless. He was patient. The cannons were not just weapons. They were symbols of a new age. Medieval warfare, with its reliance on impregnable fortresses, was giving way to gunpowder empires. Each explosion echoed beyond the battlefield. It signalled the end of one world and the beginning of another, a world where stone alone would never be enough again. While the cannons battered the land walls, another front remained secure, or so the defenders believed. The Golden Horn, the long natural harbour curving into Constantinople, was protected by a massive iron chain stretched across its entrance. The chain had worked before. Enemy fleets had been stopped cold, forced to remain outside while the city focused its defences elsewhere. The Byzantine navy was small, but the chain gave them confidence. As long as the harbour remained secure, supplies and limited reinforcements could still move. It was a fragile lifeline, but it existed. Mehmed II saw the problem clearly. He could pound the land walls endlessly, but if the harbour remained untouched, the city would not suffocate. So he did something audacious. Instead of trying to break the chain directly, he decided to go around it. Under cover of night, Ottoman engineers prepared a wooden track system across the hills north of the harbour. Logs were greased, pathways were cleared, and then, in one of the most astonishing logistical feats of the siege, dozens of Ottoman ships were dragged overland. Not sailed, dragged. Imagine waking at dawn inside the city and hearing rumours spread through the streets. Ships in the harbour. Impossible. But when citizens climbed the walls and looked out, there they were. Ottoman vessels floating inside the Golden Horn, behind the chain, behind what had felt like safety. Panic rippled through Constantinople. The manoeuvre was not just strategic, it was psychological warfare. It demonstrated creativity, determination, and a refusal to accept conventional limits. Mehmed was not merely besieging the city, he was outthinking it. Now the defenders had to split their forces further. Cannons roared on the land side. Ottoman ships threatened from within the harbour. Every wall felt thinner, every soldier more stretched. The Golden Horn had once symbolised protection. Now it symbolised vulnerability. The siege tightened like a fist. And for the first time, even the most optimistic citizens began to understand something unsettling. This was not just another siege in a long history of sieges. This one was different. This one was relentless. As the walls shook and Ottoman ships appeared in the Golden Horn, something else intensified inside Constantinople. Faith. When military solutions begin to fail, people turn to heaven. The city had long believed itself protected by divine favour. It was not just a capital, it was the new Rome, the heart of Eastern Christianity. Its great cathedral, Hagia Sophia, stood as both architectural wonder and spiritual fortress. Massive domes rising above marble columns, mosaics shimmering in candlelight. It felt eternal. But eternity suddenly seemed fragile. In the weeks leading up to the final assault, religious processions wound through the streets. Icons were carried along the walls. Priests chanted prayers for deliverance. Citizens wept openly. Some believed the Virgin Mary would intervene as she had in earlier sieges. Others feared that the city's sins had finally outweighed its sanctity. There was also tension beneath the prayers. Years earlier, in a desperate attempt to secure Western aid, Byzantine leaders had agreed to a controversial union between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. Many citizens resented this compromise. They saw it as betrayal. The theological divide between East and West was not easily bridged. Now, facing annihilation, those divisions felt painfully irrelevant. On the evening before the final assault, Constantine XI Palaiologos entered Hagia Sophia for what would become the last Christian liturgy held there as an imperial cathedral. Nobles, soldiers, clergy, and common citizens gathered together. Greeks and Italians, supporters of union and opponents alike. For a brief moment, unity replaced argument. The emperor reportedly asked forgiveness for any wrongs he had committed. Communion was shared. Candles flickered beneath the vast dome. Outside, Ottoman campfires burned like a ring of stars. It is easy to focus on cannons and tactics, but that night was about something quieter, the recognition that a world was ending. Some still hoped for a miracle. Others understood that miracles sometimes arrive in forms no one expects. When the liturgy ended, the emperor returned to the walls. The soldiers took their positions. The city waited. Dawn was coming, and with it, the final test of stone, steel, and faith. Before dawn on the 29th of May, 1453, the silence outside Constantinople broke. Drums thundered. War cries rose. Torches flickered in the early darkness. Mehmed II had given the order. The full assault would begin. The attack came in waves. First, irregular troops surged forward. Lightly armed fighters sent to exhaust the defenders and test weak points. They climbed ladders, hurled themselves at breaches, and fell beneath arrows, stones, and gunfire. Behind them came better-trained Anatolian soldiers, pressing harder, forcing the Byzantines to spend precious strength holding crumbling sections of wall. At the centre of the defence stood Constantine XI Palaiologos and his most capable foreign ally, Giovanni Giustiniani. They focused their efforts near the gate of St. Romanus, where earlier cannon fire had done the most damage. The fighting was brutal and intimate. Smoke filled the air. Shouts and metal clashed in the narrow breaches. Bodies piled in the rubble where ancient stone met modern gunpowder. Each time Ottoman troops pushed through, they were forced back. Each time the defenders repelled them, fewer men remained to hold the line. Then came the Janissaries, elite, disciplined, relentless. They advanced in formation, shields locked, supported by constant artillery fire. At a critical moment, Giustiniani was severely wounded. His removal from the battlefield shook morale. Some defenders began to pull back. Coordination faltered. In siege warfare, morale can break before walls do. Amid the chaos, a small gate, possibly left unsecured or forced open, allowed Ottoman soldiers to slip inside. The banner of the Sultan was raised atop the walls. Once that symbol appeared, psychological resistance collapsed. Constantine XI, refusing to flee, is said to have cast aside his imperial regalia and charged into the fighting as an ordinary soldier. He was never conclusively identified among the dead. The last Roman emperor disappeared into the smoke of battle. By mid-morning, the city was lost. The walls that had stood for a millennium had finally yielded, not to patience alone, but to innovation, persistence, and overwhelming force. A chapter of history closed in blood and dust, and a new empire stepped through the gates. By the time the sun rose fully over Constantinople, the banner of Mehmed II flew above the walls. The fighting had ended. The empire that once called itself Rome had vanished in a single morning. As was customary after a successful siege, the city was subjected to hours of looting. Soldiers flooded through streets that had echoed with Greek hymns the night before. Homes were broken open, churches stripped, citizens taken captive. It was brutal, chaotic, and tragically predictable for medieval warfare. Yet Mehmed did not intend to reduce Constantinople to ruins. When he entered the city later that day, accounts describe a ruler both triumphant and deliberate. He rode through streets lined with devastation, but saw something beyond it: opportunity. He did not want a destroyed capital. He wanted a new one. He made his way to Hagia Sophia. The great cathedral, once the heart of Eastern Christendom, stood silent. Mehmed ordered it converted into a mosque. Islamic prayer was recited beneath the massive dome. The transformation was symbolic and immediate. The spiritual centre of Byzantium now belonged to the Ottomans, but the building itself was preserved. That decision mattered. Rather than raze the city, Mehmed sought to repopulate and rebuild it. He invited Muslims, Christians, and Jews from across his expanding empire to settle there. Artisans, merchants, scholars, all were encouraged to return life to the emptied streets. Constantinople would not disappear. It would become Istanbul, the beating heart of a rising Ottoman Empire that would stretch across 3 continents. The fall was not just destruction, it was transfer. Administratively, culturally, and religiously, the city shifted identities. Greek-speaking imperial bureaucrats were replaced by Ottoman officials. Churches became mosques, though some Christian communities were allowed to continue under Ottoman oversight. The Patriarch of the Orthodox Church was reinstalled, but now under the Sultan's authority. The shockwaves extended far beyond the Bosporus. What had once been the eastern shield of Europe was now an Ottoman stronghold. Trade routes shifted, political balances trembled. The fall of Constantinople was not merely the end of something ancient. It was the beginning of something powerful and enduring. When Constantinople fell, it was not only soldiers and civilians who fled, books fled. For centuries, the Byzantine world had preserved ancient Greek manuscripts, works of philosophy, science, medicine, and literature that had long vanished from much of Western Europe. While the Latin West had preserved parts of Roman thought, many original Greek texts survived primarily in Byzantine libraries and monasteries. As the Ottoman grip tightened, scholars gathered what they could carry. Some had already left before the final assault, sensing what was coming. Others escaped in the chaos that followed. They crossed the sea toward Italian cities like Florence and Venice, carrying manuscripts by Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, and Ptolemy, often in fragile, hand-copied form. These were not just books. They were intellectual time capsules. In Florence, patrons such as the powerful Medici family welcomed Greek scholars. Translators began working feverishly to render ancient texts into Latin. The rediscovery of Plato's full works, in particular, electrified Renaissance thinkers. Philosophy, art, architecture, and science all felt the influence. It is tempting to imagine the Renaissance as purely an Italian rebirth, but it was also a migration of memory. The fall of Constantinople accelerated an already growing hunger in Italy for classical knowledge. Greek teachers instructed Western students in language and philosophy. Libraries expanded. Humanism deepened. One could argue that as the Eastern Roman Empire ended politically, it survived intellectually, reborn in lecture halls and workshops across Italy. There is a tragic poetry in that. Cannons shattered walls, but ideas slipped through cracks no army could seal. Mehmed II secured a capital and forged a formidable empire. Yet the intellectual heritage of Byzantium quietly seeded another transformation in Western Europe. Some historians debate how decisive this refugee wave truly was. The Renaissance had begun before 1453, but there is little doubt that the influx of Greek scholarship intensified its momentum. When Constantinople fell, an empire collapsed. But its knowledge did not burn with it. It travelled. And in travelling, it reshaped the future of Europe. News did not travel instantly in 1453, but when it arrived, it landed like a hammer. Constantinople had fallen. For centuries, the city had stood as a bulwark between Europe and expanding Islamic powers. It was more than a distant capital. It was symbolic, the last living fragment of the Roman Empire, a Christian stronghold guarding the eastern approaches of the continent. Now it belonged to Mehmed II. Courts across Europe reacted with alarm. In Rome, the papacy called for renewed crusades. In Venice and Genoa, merchants recalculated trade routes with nervous urgency. Kings and princes wondered what this meant for their own borders. Was the Ottoman army unstoppable? Fear amplified reality. The Ottomans had demonstrated military innovation, discipline, and strategic brilliance. Gunpowder artillery had changed the rules of siege warfare. The psychological impact was enormous. If Constantinople could fall, what city was truly safe? Trade networks were forced to adapt. The Ottomans now controlled key routes between Europe and Asia. While commerce did not stop, in fact, trade continued under Ottoman oversight, European powers became increasingly motivated to find alternative pathways to the east. Some historians argue that this pressure contributed indirectly to the age of exploration. If overland and eastern Mediterranean routes were under Ottoman dominance, perhaps the ocean offered another way. Within decades, ships would sail westward and southward in search of spices, silk, and gold. But in 1453, none of that was certain. What was certain was that a millennium-old empire had vanished. The phrase Roman Empire no longer described a living state in the East. The mantle of Rome became symbolic, contested, reinterpreted. The Holy Roman Empire in Central Europe claimed continuity. The Ottomans, too, adopted the title of Caesar in their own way. History does not end neatly, it shifts. For many Europeans, the fall of Constantinople felt like divine punishment, political failure, or apocalyptic omen. Sermons warned of judgment. Chronicles recorded grief and disbelief. Yet history is rarely only tragedy. The shock forced adaptation. Military reforms accelerated. Diplomatic strategies evolved. Intellectual curiosity deepened. An ending had occurred. But as Europe reeled from the fall, it was already, quietly, preparing for transformation. When Constantinople fell in 1453, something ancient finally exhaled. For nearly 15 centuries, the Roman state, reshaped, renamed, Christianized, divided, had survived in one form or another. Even after the western half collapsed, the eastern half endured. Its citizens still called themselves Romans. Its emperors still claimed Caesar's legacy. Its laws, bureaucracy and ceremonies traced back to antiquity. With the death of Constantine XI Palaiologos, that unbroken imperial line ended. There was no formal surrender ceremony, no treaty signed beneath a banner. The empire dissolved in smoke and rubble. Rome, in its final incarnation, disappeared on the battlefield. But history rarely respects clean endings. Mehmed II did not see himself as a destroyer alone. He adopted the title Kaiser-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome. In his mind, conquest did not erase Roman authority. It transferred it. The capital had changed rulers, not significance. Istanbul would become one of the most powerful cities on earth. From there, Ottoman armies would expand into southeastern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. The empire that replaced Byzantium would endure for centuries. At the same time, Western Europe moved in a different direction. The influx of Greek scholarship enriched the Renaissance. The shock of Ottoman expansion pushed maritime exploration. Military architecture evolved to respond to artillery. Political thinkers began reimagining the nature of state power. The fall of Constantinople did not simply close the medieval chapter. It helped open the early modern one. Gunpowder empires rose. Global trade networks expanded. The Atlantic world began to overshadow the Mediterranean. Within decades, ships would cross oceans unknown to Europeans. It is tempting to view 1453 as a neat dividing line between eras. Historians debate that simplicity, but symbolically, it resonates. The ancient world, anchored in Rome and its heirs, gave way to something different, more global, more volatile, more interconnected. The walls that had once protected an empire could not withstand a new age of warfare. Yet from their collapse emerged transformation. The fall of Constantinople was not just the end of the Eastern Roman Empire, it was the moment the medieval world cracked and the modern one began to take shape. In the spring of 1607, 3 small English ships pushed their way into the Chesapeake Bay after months at sea. The Susan Constant, the Godspeed and the Discovery carried just over 100 men and a fragile idea. They were not conquerors backed by a massive royal army. They were investors' hopes, packed into wooden hulls creaking across the Atlantic. This was capitalism before comfort. The expedition had been organised by the Virginia Company of London, a joint stock company fueled by private investors who expected returns. Gold, precious metals, valuable exports, something that would justify the expense and risk. Spain had grown rich from American treasure. England wanted its share. The settlers who disembarked were a mixed group. There were gentlemen unused to manual labour, soldiers seeking advancement, craftsmen, and a few skilled workers. Many expected to discover immediate wealth. Few expected to farm. Fewer expected starvation. When they selected their settlement site along the James River, they believed they were being strategic. The location, later named Jamestown in honour of King James, was inland enough to avoid easy Spanish naval attack. It had deep water for ships to anchor close to shore. From a defensive standpoint, it made sense. From a survival standpoint, it was disastrous. The area was swampy. The water was brackish and often contaminated. Mosquitoes thrived. Disease followed. The land was not ideal for immediate agriculture, and relations with the local Powhatan Confederacy were uncertain from the start. Yet optimism prevailed. The settlers quickly constructed a triangular wooden fort, erected crude shelters, and began exploring the surrounding region. Many still believed they would find gold deposits or a navigable route westward. America, to them, was less a home and more a prospecting field. But reality pressed in quickly. Food supplies dwindled. Clean water was scarce. Labour was unevenly distributed. Leadership disputes began almost immediately. The New World did not bend to expectation. Jamestown was founded on hope, but it stood on unstable ground. And within months, that dream of easy riches would collide with hunger, disease, and the sobering truth that survival required far more than ambition. The first months at Jamestown stripped away illusion quickly. The settlers had crossed an ocean dreaming of gold. What they found instead was mud, insects, and water that made them sick. The James River, though wide and seemingly generous, was brackish and often polluted by tidal shifts. Drinking it led to dysentery and typhoid. Mosquitoes carried malaria. Within weeks, men who had stepped ashore with confidence were shivering with fever. And still, some searched for gold. Members of the expedition spent valuable time exploring for precious metals rather than planting crops or securing stable food supplies. There is something tragically human about it. Starving men sifting river sand, convinced wealth must be hiding just beneath the surface. It was not. The leadership structure only added tension. The governing council, appointed by the Virginia Company of London, was plagued by internal disputes. Personal rivalries and mistrust weakened coordination. Decisions were delayed or contested while supplies dwindled. Among the more assertive figures was John Smith. Practical and blunt, he recognized a brutal truth. If the colony did not prioritize survival over speculation, it would collapse. He imposed discipline, famously declaring that those who did not work would not eat. It was not a popular policy, but it was necessary. Meanwhile, relations with the Powhatan Confederacy oscillated between cautious trade and open hostility. The English depended heavily on local indigenous communities for corn. Without it, starvation would have come far sooner. Even so, mortality was staggering. By the end of the first year, nearly half the original settlers were dead. Disease, malnutrition, and internal chaos had carved the colony down to a fraction of its hopeful beginnings. And still, no gold. Jamestown's early months were a collision between expectation and environment. Investors imagined treasure fleets. Settlers imagined quick fortunes. Instead, they faced an unfamiliar climate, limited supplies, and the unforgiving mathematics of hunger. The dream had not yet died, but it was thinner now, more fragile. Jamestown was no longer about riches. It was about survival. Long before English ships appeared on the horizon, the land around Jamestown was not empty wilderness. It was home. The region was part of a powerful political alliance known as the Powhatan Confederacy, led by Powhatan. This was not a loose gathering of isolated villages. It was a structured network of Algonquian-speaking communities connected through tribute, trade, and shared leadership. Fields of corn, beans, and squash stretched across cleared land. Fishing, hunting, and seasonal movement sustained a balanced way of life. When the English arrived, they entered a complex world they did not understand. At first, interactions were cautious. The English needed food. The Powhatan people assessed the newcomers carefully. Trade began. Copper tools and beads exchanged for corn. But trust was thin. The settlers built a fortified enclosure almost immediately, signaling suspicion as much as defense. The Powhatan Confederacy had seen outsiders before. Spanish explorers had touched parts of the southeastern coast. But a permanent settlement was different. These men were not passing through. They were building. Among the most famous moments of early contact involves John Smith and Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas. According to Smith's later account, he was captured and brought before Powhatan, where Pocahontas intervened to spare his life. Historians debate the details. Some believe the event may have been a ritual adoption ceremony misunderstood by Smith. Others question the dramatic elements entirely. What remains clear is that Pocahontas later served as an intermediary, helping facilitate communication and trade between the two groups. But beneath moments of diplomacy lay tension. The English expanded their fortifications and demanded food during drought years. The Powhatan communities faced pressure on their resources. Raids and retaliations followed. What began as cautious coexistence gradually hardened into suspicion and violence. To the English, the land represented opportunity and divine mandate. To the Powhatan, it was ancestral territory. Jamestown's survival depended on indigenous knowledge and resources, yet the English rarely acknowledged that dependence as permanent. Instead, they viewed it as temporary assistance in a project of expansion. The clash was not immediate annihilation. It was a slow, grinding conflict of worldview, power, and survival, one that would shape colonial America long after Jamestown's fragile beginnings. If the early months at Jamestown were difficult, the winter of 1609 to 1610 was catastrophic. This period would later be remembered simply as the starving time. By then, the colony had already endured disease, unstable leadership, and uneasy relations with the Powhatan Confederacy. When new settlers arrived in 1609, they increased the population dramatically, but without bringing sufficient supplies or agricultural planning to match. Then drought struck. Relations with the Powhatan deteriorated sharply. Trade collapsed. Indigenous communities, facing their own shortages, refused to continue feeding the English. In some cases, they actively besieged the fort, cutting off access to hunting and foraging grounds. Jamestown became a trap. Food stores ran out quickly. Horses were slaughtered. Dogs disappeared. Rats were eaten. Leather was boiled down for nourishment. Contemporary accounts describe settlers digging up roots, consuming vermin, and growing skeletal from hunger. Archaeological evidence suggests that cannibalism may have occurred during this desperate winter. Human remains show signs consistent with butchering. Whether widespread or isolated, the possibility underscores how severe conditions became. Leadership faltered. Disease spread through weakened bodies. Fear replaced ambition. Of the roughly 500 colonists present before winter, only about 60 survived by spring. 60. The fort that had once symbolized English expansion became a place of death and despair. When ships finally arrived from England in 1610, the survivors were prepared to abandon the settlement entirely. They boarded the vessels and began sailing downriver, ready to leave Jamestown behind as a failed experiment. But fate intervened. As they departed, they encountered a new fleet led by Lord de la Warr, bringing fresh supplies and reinforcements. He ordered the colonists to return. Jamestown, on the brink of extinction, was forced back into existence. The starving time marked a brutal turning point. Illusions of easy wealth had vanished. Survival now required discipline, agriculture, and stronger military posture. Jamestown did not thrive because it was easy. It endured because it refused, barely, to disappear. Jamestown survived the starving time, but survival alone was not enough. The Virginia Company of London had not invested in the colony for symbolic endurance. It wanted profit. Without a valuable export, Jamestown would remain a drain rather than a return. The breakthrough came not from gold mines or a passage to Asia, but from a plant. John Rolfe introduced a strain of tobacco cultivated from Caribbean seeds. The native tobacco grown in Virginia was considered harsh by European standards. Rolfe's imported variety, however, was smoother and more appealing to English consumers. It sold. Demand for tobacco in England surged. What had once been dismissed by some as a foul habit became fashionable across London. Ships that once carried settlers and supplies began returning to England, filled with tightly packed barrels of cured leaf. Jamestown finally had its economic engine. But tobacco changed everything. It required land, large amounts of it. Fields had to be cleared and cultivated continuously. Expansion pushed English settlements outward, deeper into territories claimed and used by Powhatan communities. What had been fragile coexistence increasingly became violent competition. Labour became another problem. Tobacco farming was demanding. The surviving colonists could not sustain large-scale production alone. Initially, the colony relied on indentured servants, men and women, who agreed to work for several years in exchange for passage to America. But over time, the labour system hardened. In 1619, the first recorded Africans arrived in Virginia. Though their exact legal status at the time is debated, this moment marked the beginning of what would become a racialized system of chattel slavery in English North America. Jamestown was no longer a desperate outpost clinging to survival. It was becoming the foundation of a plantation economy. Tobacco saved the colony financially. It also locked Virginia into patterns of land expansion, labor exploitation, and social inequality that would define colonial America for generations. The dream of gold had failed. But green leaves, dried, rolled, and shipped across the Atlantic, succeeded. Jamestown had found its profit, and with profit came permanence. As tobacco profits stabilized Jamestown, another transformation began, political rather than agricultural. The Virginia Company of London realized something important. Survival in Virginia required more than supplies and soldiers. It required settlers who believed they had a stake in the colony's future. In 1619, the company authorized the creation of a representative assembly known as the House of Burgesses. It was a modest gathering by modern standards, 2 elected representatives from each settlement meeting alongside the governor and his council. But symbolically, it was groundbreaking. For the first time in English America, colonists could participate directly in local lawmaking. They could debate taxes, labor policies, and land issues. Decisions were no longer dictated solely by distant investors in London. Authority was shared, at least partially, with men living in the colony itself. The first session met in a wooden church at Jamestown. Conditions were still harsh. The air was humid. Disease lingered. But inside that crude building, a precedent was set: self-government. It was limited. Only property-owning men could vote or hold office. Indigenous peoples and Africans had no representation. Women were excluded entirely. Still, the idea had taken root. Colonists should have a voice in their governance. This political experiment was not purely idealistic. It was practical. If settlers felt empowered, they were more likely to stay. Stability meant productivity. Productivity meant profit. Yet unintended consequences often shape history more than intended ones. The House of Burgesses became a training ground for political thought in North America. Generations later, colonial leaders would invoke similar principles when arguing against British taxation without representation. Jamestown, born from corporate ambition and near starvation, had inadvertently laid the groundwork for participatory politics in what would eventually become the United States. The same year that marked the arrival of Africans and the expansion of tobacco also marked the beginning of representative governance. Jamestown's legacy was not singular. It was contradictory, a place where democracy and inequality grew side by side. From a swampy fort built in desperation, a political tradition began to take shape. And that tradition would echo far beyond the wooden walls of early Virginia. Tobacco expanded, settlements spread, and tension hardened into open war. As English colonists pushed beyond the narrow confines of Jamestown, they cleared more land for fields and plantations. Fences went up, rivers were claimed, hunting grounds shrank. What had once been cautious coexistence with the Powhatan Confederacy became unsustainable. After the death of Powhatan, leadership passed to his brother, Opechancanough. Unlike earlier attempts at uneasy accommodation, Opechancanough recognized the accelerating threat. The English were not temporary traders. They were settlers, and settlers, by definition, stayed. In 1622, he launched a coordinated attack across English settlements. On a single day in March, Powhatan warriors struck multiple outposts simultaneously. Nearly a third of the English population in Virginia was killed. Farms burned. Isolated settlements were abandoned. The colony was shaken to its core. Jamestown itself survived, warned at the last moment, but the illusion of security was shattered. The English response was swift and brutal. Retaliatory raids devastated indigenous villages. Crops were destroyed. Cycles of violence intensified over the following years. What might once have been a shared landscape became a militarized frontier. The attack of 1622 marked a turning point. English attitudes hardened. Indigenous communities were increasingly portrayed as obstacles to be removed, rather than neighbours to negotiate with. Expansion no longer carried even the pretense of coexistence. Another uprising in 1644, led again by Opechancanough, ended in his capture and death. After that, organised resistance weakened significantly. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Jamestown had survived famine and disease. Now it survived war, but at a profound moral and human cost. The colony that had once depended on indigenous food and knowledge now advanced through displacement and force. Fields of tobacco replaced forests. English law replaced tribal sovereignty. The founding of Jamestown was never a peaceful beginning. It was the start of a long, complicated struggle over land, power, and survival, one that would define American history from its earliest days. The frontier was no longer uncertain. It was contested and increasingly claimed. For years, Jamestown had survived by improvisation, private investors, fragile leadership, tobacco profits, and constant tension on the frontier. But survival did not mean stability. The Virginia Company of London had poured money into Virginia with the expectation of consistent returns. Instead, it faced criticism in England. Reports of starvation, indigenous wars, high mortality, and administrative chaos damaged its reputation. Then came legal battles among shareholders. Accusations of mismanagement surfaced. The Crown watched closely. In 1624, King James revoked the company's charter. Virginia was no longer a corporate experiment. It became a royal colony. This shift mattered. Under royal control, the governor would answer directly to the Crown rather than to distant investors. The House of Burgesses remained, but ultimate authority tightened. England's interest in Virginia was no longer purely economic. It was political and strategic. The colony, once a risky business venture, had become a permanent extension of English power. Jamestown itself continued to function as the colonial capital for decades, but its physical vulnerability never fully disappeared. Fires repeatedly damaged the settlement. Disease remained a constant presence. In time, the capital would move to Williamsburg. Yet the significance of Jamestown endured. It had been the first permanent English foothold in North America. Not the first attempt, earlier efforts like Roanoke had failed, but the first to survive long enough to anchor a broader colonial system. Under royal authority, Virginia's plantation economy deepened. Tobacco exports expanded. The labor system increasingly relied on enslaved Africans. Social hierarchies hardened. Jamestown's early fragility faded into institutional permanence. What began as an uncertain gamble had become policy. England now had a template: establish settlement, secure export crops, create local governance, expand territory. That model would replicate across North America in different forms. The transformation from company colony to royal colony marked the end of Jamestown's experimental phase. It was no longer struggling to justify its existence. It had proven it would endure. And in enduring, it reshaped the trajectory of English, and eventually American, history. By the time Jamestown faded as a physical capital, its legacy was already embedded in the structure of colonial America. Jamestown was never a shining utopia. It was not founded on religious unity like later New England settlements. It was not carefully planned or morally consistent. It was chaotic, profit-driven, and often brutal. Yet it endured. From that endurance came patterns that would define the future. First, economic ambition. The colony survived because of tobacco. A single cash crop tied Virginia to transatlantic markets and global demand. That connection between land, labor, and export would shape the southern colonies for generations. Second, labor systems. What began with indentured servants evolved into race-based slavery. The arrival of Africans in 1619 marked the beginning of a transformation that would harden into one of the most consequential institutions in American history. Jamestown was not the only origin point, but it was an early one. Third, political precedent. The House of Burgesses established representative governance in English America. Limited and exclusive, yes, but foundational. Colonists grew accustomed to participating in lawmaking. That expectation of political voice would later fuel revolutionary arguments against British control. Fourth, expansion and displacement. Jamestown's survival depended on land. Land required expansion. Expansion required confrontation with indigenous peoples. The conflicts that began in Virginia foreshadowed centuries of territorial struggle across the continent. Jamestown teaches something sobering. Colonial America was not born from certainty or moral clarity. It was born from risk, miscalculation, hunger, ambition, and adaptation. It nearly failed multiple times. It survived by chance, by tobacco, by indigenous assistance, and by relentless persistence. The myth of an effortless founding dissolves under scrutiny. Instead, we find something more human and more complicated. A handful of ships arrived in 1607 with dreams of gold. They found mud, disease, and conflict. They nearly vanished, but they stayed. And from that fragile beginning grew a colonial system that would expand, transform, and eventually give rise to a new nation. Jamestown was not glorious. It was foundational. And sometimes foundations are laid in struggle rather than triumph.